The knock came at midnight, sharp and urgent, and Duke Alexander Fairfax knew before he opened the door that his ordered life was about to end. He had spent 30 years building a reputation that made grown men lower their eyes when he passed. Servants moved quietly through his halls. Guests chose their words with care before speaking to him. London called him proud, cold, untouchable, and he had never once tried to prove them wrong. Pride was armor. Distance was safety. He had learned that lesson young, and he had never forgotten it. So when his butler, Edmund, appeared at his study door with his face pale and his hands trembling, the Duke set down his pen and frowned. "There is a child at the door, Your Grace," Edmund said. "A woman left her. She is asking for you by name." "Send her away," the Duke said, already turning back to his papers. "Whoever she is, she has the wrong house. Your Grace, I believe you should come yourself." Something in the butler's voice made him stand. He did not know why he obeyed that small, quiet feeling. He would ask himself that question many times in the months that followed, and he would never find a satisfying answer. Some things simply happen, and afterward, a person's whole life is divided into before and after. The night air was cold when he stepped onto the front steps. Rain had fallen earlier, and the stone was still wet beneath his boots. A carriage was pulling away down the street, its wheels clattering over the cobblestones, moving too fast for him to see who sat inside. And there, on the top step of his own townhouse, wrapped in a thin gray blanket, sat a little girl. She could not have been more than 4 years old. Her hair was dark and curled at the ends, damp from the rain. Her eyes, when she lifted them to his face, were a pale, striking gray, the kind of gray that belonged to storm clouds before they broke. She did not cry. She did not look afraid. She simply looked at him, studying his face, the way a much older person might, and then she smiled. "Papa," she said. The word struck him like a physical blow. He took a step back without meaning to. Edmund, standing just behind him, made a small sound of surprise. "There has been a mistake," the Duke said, though his voice did not sound as certain as he wanted it to. "Find out who left her. Send word to the constables if you must. She cannot stay here." But even as he said it, he was already crouching down in front of her, some instinct older than his pride pulling him closer. There was a folded piece of paper tucked into the blanket, and he pulled it free with careful fingers. The handwriting was faded, rushed, written by someone in a hurry or someone very ill. "Her name is Rose," it said. "She is yours. Forgive me for not telling you sooner. I could not carry this weight any longer, and I have no one else to give her to. Please, keep her safe." There was no signature. The Duke read the note 3 times, as though the words might rearrange themselves into something less impossible. He looked at the girl again. She was still watching him, patient, unbothered by the cold or the strangeness of the night, as if she had always known this moment would come. "That is not possible," he said quietly, to no one in particular. But even as the words left his mouth, memory stirred in a place he had locked away years ago. A summer, 5 years past. A young woman, with gray eyes and a soft laugh, who had loved him before his family decided she was unsuitable. She had disappeared from London without warning, without a farewell, and he had told himself it did not matter, that she had simply grown tired of him, that a man in his position could not afford to chase after a woman his mother disapproved of. He had never learned her fate. He had never allowed himself to ask. Now a child with her eyes sat on his doorstep calling him Papa, and the careful, ordered world he had built around himself began to crack. "Bring her inside," he said finally, his voice rougher than before. "Warm her, feed her. I will decide what is to be done in the morning." Edmund hesitated only a moment before obeying. As the girl was lifted and carried through the grand doorway of Fairfax House, she looked back over the housekeeper's shoulder at the Duke, who stood frozen on his own front steps, and she smiled at him again, small and unafraid, as though she already trusted him completely. He did not sleep that night. He sat in his study with the note in his hands, reading it again and again, searching for some flaw in its logic, some proof that this was a trick, a scheme, a stranger's cruel joke. But the eyes. He could not explain away the eyes. By morning, 3 of his oldest and most trusted friends already knew a child had arrived at his home in the middle of the night. By afternoon, half of London's drawing rooms were whispering about it. The Duke of Fairfax, the proudest, coldest man in the city, had a daughter no one had ever heard of, and society was hungry to know more. He told himself it did not matter what they said. He told himself many things that week, most of which were untrue. The girl, Rose, settled into his household with a calm that unsettled him more than tears would have. She wandered the long hallways of Fairfax House with wide eyes, touching the edges of paintings, humming small songs to herself, utterly unafraid of the enormous, silent home, or the tall, stern man who owned it. When she was hungry, she asked for food plainly. When she was tired, she found a corner and curled up like a cat, needing no comfort, expecting none. It was that quiet independence that first caught at something inside him. She did not cling. She did not weep for a mother who was, he now suspected, no longer living. She simply existed, small and steady, in the middle of his enormous, empty house, as though she had decided that whatever happened next, she would face it without complaint. He watched her from a distance for 3 days before he allowed himself to speak to her directly. "Do you know where your mother is?" he asked her one afternoon, kneeling so that he was closer to her height, something he had never done for anyone in his adult life. Rose considered the question with the seriousness of someone twice her age. "She went to sleep," she said. "The lady said she would not wake up. The lady said I should find my papa." His chest tightened. "What lady?" "The lady who took care of us. She had yellow hair." Rose tilted her head. "Are you sad, Papa?" "I am not your father," he said, though the words felt hollow even as he spoke them. "We do not yet know that for certain." "You have my eyes," Rose said simply, and went back to studying the pattern of the carpet, as though the matter were already settled in her mind, and it was only the adults around her who needed time to catch up. He did not correct her again. That night, after Rose had finally fallen asleep in the small guest chamber the housekeeper had hastily prepared, the Duke walked the length of his own house like a stranger inside it. He passed the portraits of his ancestors, stern-faced men who had built the Fairfax name through careful marriages and careful silences, and he found himself wondering, for the first time in his adult life, whether any of them had ever loved something enough to risk what he was now being asked to risk. He stopped outside the guest chamber door and listened. He could hear nothing but the soft, even breathing of a sleeping child, and yet he stood there for a long while, unwilling to leave, unwilling to admit why he could not make himself walk away. Edmund found him there near midnight, still standing in the corridor. "Your Grace," the butler said carefully, "is there anything you require?" "Tell me honestly, Edmund. You have served this family for 20 years. What would you have me do?" The old butler considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "I would have you remember, Your Grace, that a house this large has stood empty of laughter for a very long time. Whatever the truth of her birth, that child has already brought more warmth into these halls in 3 days than I have witnessed in the past 10 years. The Duke said nothing, but the words settled into him, quiet and undeniable, and he did not sleep again that night, not because of worry, but because some part of him, long dormant, had begun to stir awake. That evening, his mother arrived at Fairfax House without warning, as she often did when scandal was involved. The Dowager Duchess Margaret swept into his study with the particular energy of a woman who had heard rumors and intended to have them confirmed or denied immediately. "Is it true?" she demanded. "Is there truly a child in this house claiming to be yours?" "Her name is Rose," the Duke said. "I do not yet know the truth of her claim." "You do not need to know the truth, Alexander. You need to know how this looks. A child appearing on your doorstep in the dead of night, no mother in sight, no proof of legitimacy. If this becomes known widely, and it will, you understand, it already is known. It could ruin any chance of a respectable match. It could ruin the family name." "The family name," he repeated, and something bitter rose in his throat. "Is that truly your concern, Mother? Not the fate of a 4-year-old girl who has just lost her mother, but the family name?" The Dowager Duchess's expression flickered, just for a moment, something that might have been guilt passing behind her eyes, before she smoothed it away. "I am only thinking of what is practical." "Practical?" he said quietly. He thought of the young woman with gray eyes who had vanished 5 years ago, and a cold suspicion began to form in his mind, one he was not yet ready to speak aloud. "We will discuss this another time, Mother. Tonight, I have a child to see settled." She left in a huff of silk skirts and disapproval, and the Duke stood alone in his study for a long time afterward, staring at nothing, turning over questions that had no easy answers. He needed help. He could not raise a child alone, not a man like him, unfamiliar with the softness such a task required. By the end of the week, he had sent inquiries to the finest agencies in London, seeking a governess of impeccable character, someone capable of managing a household addition, as delicate and as scrutinized as this one. The woman who arrived at his door 3 days later carried herself with a quiet, careful composure that immediately set her apart from the others he had interviewed. Her name was Eleanor Marsh. She was perhaps 26, dressed simply but neatly, with dark hair pulled back and sharp, intelligent eyes that studied him as thoroughly as he studied her. "You come highly recommended," he said, glancing over her letters of reference. "Though I confess, the household you would be joining is somewhat unusual." "I am aware of the circumstances, Your Grace," Eleanor said. "London is not a city that keeps its secrets quietly. Then you understand what is required: discretion, patience, and a certain steadiness, given the child's recent losses." "I understand loss," Eleanor said, and something in her voice made him look up sharply, but her expression gave nothing away, calm and professional, betraying no hint of the storm she was holding carefully beneath the surface. She did not tell him, not that day, that she recognized the name Rose the moment she heard it. She did not tell him that 5 years ago she had held her dearest friend's hand as that friend wept over a love she could not keep, a love the Fairfax family had deemed unsuitable. She did not tell him that she had watched that same friend leave London in shame, carrying a secret she refused to burden the Duke with, believing until her final days that he would have chosen his family over her regardless. Eleanor Marsh knew exactly whose child Rose was, and she had absolutely no intention of telling the Duke the truth until she understood what kind of man he had become. "There is one more matter," the Duke said, before she could rise. "The child does not yet trust easily, though she hides it well behind that fearless manner of hers. I would ask that you take particular care with her in these first weeks. She has already lost a mother. I will not have her lose a governess to impatience as well." "I do not tire of children easily, Your Grace," Eleanor said. "Especially not children who have already learned to be braver than they should have needed to be." Something in the way she said it made the Duke look at her more closely, but she offered nothing further, and he did not press. "When can you begin?" the Duke asked. "Immediately, Your Grace, if it pleases you." "It does," he said, and for the first time since the girl had arrived on his doorstep, something in his chest loosened, just slightly, as though help had finally come. He watched her climb the stairs a short while later, already asking a passing maid where she might find the nursery, already moving through his house with a quiet purpose that suggested she did not intend to simply manage the child from a distance. He told himself it was merely relief at having found a capable governess so quickly. He would not admit, not yet, that it was something closer to hope. He had no idea, standing there in his grand and empty study, that the governess he had just hired held the very truth he had been too afraid to seek. He had no idea that the quiet, careful woman before him would soon become the second person to crack open the walls he had spent a lifetime building. He only knew that the house felt different now, less silent, less cold. Somewhere upstairs, Rose was singing softly to herself, a tune with no real words, content in a home she had claimed as her own within days of arriving. And the proudest Duke in London stood very still, listening, wondering when exactly he had stopped wanting to send her away. Eleanor Marsh arrived at Fairfax House with a single trunk and a heart full of careful, guarded plans. She told herself, climbing the front steps on her first morning, that she would do her duty, care for the child, and say nothing of the past that connected her to this household in ways the Duke could not yet imagine. She told herself she was strong enough to keep that secret buried. She had not expected the child to run to her within the first hour and take her hand as though she had known her forever. "You have kind eyes," Rose said, looking up at her new governess with the same open trust she had shown the Duke on that first rainy night. "The lady with yellow hair," said kind eyes mean a kind heart. Eleanor's breath caught. The lady with yellow hair, she realized with a pang, must have been the nursemaid who had cared for Rose and her mother in their final months. Someone Eleanor had never met, but had heard mentioned in letters, years ago, before the letters had stopped coming altogether. "Your mother," Eleanor said carefully, kneeling down. "She must have loved you very much, to make certain you were brought somewhere safe." Rose nodded solemnly. "She said Papa would keep me safe. She said he did not know about me, but he would want to, if he knew. She said he had a good heart, even though he hides it." Eleanor felt tears sting unexpectedly behind her eyes. It was such a simple thing for a child to say, and yet it carried the weight of everything her friend had believed until the very end. A stubborn, aching faith in a man who had never been given the chance to prove her right. "I am sure that is true," Eleanor said softly, and meant it more than she expected to. The days that followed fell into a careful rhythm. Eleanor taught Rose her letters in the mornings, walked with her through the gardens in the afternoons, and sat with her each evening until she fell asleep, humming the same wordless tune Rose had brought with her from wherever her old life had been. The Duke, for his part, kept his distance at first, retreating to his study, attending to matters of business and estate, as though nothing in his household had changed. But Eleanor noticed things. She noticed how he would pause outside the nursery door in the evenings, listening for a long moment before continuing down the hall. She noticed how his voice softened, almost against his will, whenever Rose addressed him directly. She noticed, most of all, how carefully he avoided being alone with the child, as though he feared what might happen if he allowed himself to grow attached to a girl whose place in his life was still, in his mind, uncertain. It was Rose herself who broke through his careful distance, as children so often do, without any plan or strategy at all. She came to him one evening in his study, her small feet silent on the thick carpet, clutching a wooden horse that had once belonged to him as a boy, discovered in a forgotten corner of the nursery. "I had a bad dream," she said simply, standing in the doorway. The Duke looked up from his papers, startled. "Where is Miss Marsh?" "She is sleeping. I did not want to wake her." Rose's gray eyes, so like his own, were wide and uncertain in a way he had not seen from her before. For the first time since her arrival, she looked genuinely afraid. He should have called for Eleanor. He should have sent the girl back to her nursery and let the governess handle whatever comfort was needed. That was, after all, precisely what he had hired her for. But something in the small, trembling figure in his doorway made him set down his pen instead. "Come here," he said, and his voice came out gentler than he expected. Rose crossed the room and climbed, without hesitation, into the chair beside his desk, curling her small body against his side, as though she had done it 100 times before. He sat very still, unaccustomed to the weight of a child leaning into him, unaccustomed to the way his arm moved almost of its own accord to settle around her shoulders. "What was your dream?" he asked. "I dreamed my mother was calling me, but I could not find her. I looked everywhere in a big dark house, but every room was empty." He thought of the young woman with gray eyes who had once loved him, who he now understood had died believing he had abandoned her by choice, who had spent her final years in a fear and shame his own family had forced upon her. Grief, old and unexpected, rose in his throat. "She is not lost," he said carefully, choosing his words the way a man chooses his footing on unfamiliar ground. "She is simply not here anymore. But you are here, and you are safe, and no one will ever leave you in an empty house again." Rose looked up at him, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then she reached up and touched his cheek with her small hand, an oddly adult gesture from someone so young. "You are not so proud as they say," she said. He laughed, a short, surprised sound he had almost forgotten he was capable of making. "Who says such things?" "Everyone," Rose said matter-of-factly, and settled more comfortably against him, already drifting back toward sleep. "But I do not think it is true." He sat with her, until she fell asleep in the chair beside him, her small hand still resting against his sleeve. He did not move for a long while afterward, simply looking down at her face, searching it for traces of the woman he had once loved and lost, finding them everywhere, in the curve of her mouth, the shape of her eyes, the stubborn tilt of her chin even in sleep. When Eleanor came looking for Rose an hour later, she found them both in the study, the Duke still seated, the child asleep against him, and something in her chest tightened at the sight, a mixture of relief and a sorrow she had not expected to feel. "Forgive me, Your Grace," she said quietly from the doorway. "I did not realize she had left the nursery." "There is nothing to forgive," the Duke said, his voice low, so as not to wake the sleeping child. She had a bad dream. She came to me instead of you. That is unusual, Eleanor said, though she was beginning to suspect it was not unusual at all, not for a child who had inherited her mother's stubborn instinct to seek out the people worth trusting, even when trust did not come easily. Miss Marsh, the Duke said, before she could take Rose from the room, may I ask you something? Of course, Your Grace. Do you believe a man can change the course he has set for his life? Or are we simply bound to become the people our circumstances have made us? Eleanor considered the question carefully, aware of how much rested on her answer, though the Duke could not yet know it. I believe, she said slowly, that circumstances shape us, Your Grace, but they do not have the final word. I have seen people surprise even themselves. He looked at her for a long moment, something unreadable passing behind his eyes. I hope you are right, he said finally, and gently, carefully, lifted the sleeping child into his arms to carry her back to the nursery himself, refusing Eleanor's offer of help, as though he needed, for reasons he could not yet name, to carry this small weight on his own. Eleanor followed behind them in silence, watching the proudest Duke in London walk slowly down the darkened hallway, with his daughter asleep against his shoulder. And she thought of her friend, gone now these 5 years, and wondered if somewhere, somehow, she could see this moment, and know that her stubborn faith had not been misplaced after all. She thought, too, of the secret she still carried, the truth she had not yet found the courage to speak aloud, and she wondered how much longer she could keep it hidden, now that the distance between herself and the Duke was beginning, slowly and carefully, to close. A few mornings later, the Duke found himself walking through the small garden behind Fairfax House when he heard Rose's laughter carrying across the hedges. He followed the sound and found her chasing a gray cat along the garden wall, her skirts muddied at the hem, her hair coming loose from its ribbon, entirely unconcerned with appearances, in a way that struck him as both foreign and strangely refreshing. You will ruin your dress, he said, though he made no move to stop her. The cat does not care about my dress, Rose said, breathless, and neither do I. He found himself smiling, before he realized it, an unguarded smile he had not offered anyone in years. When the cat finally slipped beneath the garden wall and escaped, Rose turned to him with the particular disappointment only a small child can summon so completely, and then, just as quickly, brightened again. Will you push me on the swing, Papa? He glanced toward the house, toward the study window where a stack of unfinished correspondence waited for him, matters of business that had always taken precedence over everything else in his ordered life. Then he looked back at his daughter, waiting patiently, hopefully, for an answer. For a little while, he said, and was rewarded with a smile so bright it startled him. He pushed the swing for the better part of an hour, longer than he had intended, longer than he had spent on anything unrelated to duty and longer than he could remember. When Eleanor came to collect Rose for her afternoon lessons, she found the Duke still there, his cravat loosened, his usual careful composure entirely abandoned, laughing at something his daughter had said. She stood at the edge of the garden for a moment, unnoticed, simply watching, and felt something in her chest ache with a tenderness she had not expected to feel so soon. The weeks that followed brought a change to Fairfax House that even the servants remarked upon in quiet, careful whispers. The Duke, once known for retreating to his study before breakfast and rarely emerging before evening, began taking his morning tea in the nursery instead, watching Rose practice her letters under Eleanor's patient instruction. He learned, without quite meaning to, the particular way Rose liked her bread cut into small triangles, and the specific lullaby that settled her fastest when sleep proved difficult. He told himself these were small concessions, nothing more, the natural adjustments any responsible guardian might make. But Eleanor watched him closely during those weeks, and she saw something deeper taking root, something the man himself did not yet have words for. It was during this time that whispers of a different kind began moving through London's drawing rooms, whispers with far less warmth than the quiet affection growing inside Fairfax House. Lord Bertram Ashcombe had never liked the Duke of Fairfax. Their rivalry stretched back years, born of a contested inheritance dispute and deepened by every social triumph the Duke had claimed at Ashcombe's expense. When word reached him of the mysterious child who had appeared on the Duke's doorstep, a slow, satisfied smile spread across his face. An illegitimate child, he said to his companions over cards one evening, swirling the brandy in his glass with obvious relish. No marriage on record, no proof of the mother's identity. The great and proud Duke of Fairfax, brought low by his own indiscretion. I confess I have never enjoyed a piece of gossip more. What do you intend to do with the information? One of his companions asked. Nothing, for now, Ashcombe said. I intend to watch. A man like Fairfax will hang himself eventually, given enough rope. And when he does, I will be there to make certain all of London sees it happen. He began making careful inquiries of his own, quietly, patiently, gathering whatever fragments of information he could find about the mysterious woman who had once loved the Duke and vanished from society 5 years before. It was slow work, but Ashcombe was a patient man when the reward was significant enough, and few rewards pleased him more than the prospect of the proudest Duke in London, brought publicly to ruin. Back at Fairfax House, unaware of the storm quietly gathering beyond his walls, the Duke found himself increasingly drawn into conversation with his daughter's governess, conversations that stretched longer each evening than either of them had originally intended. You are unusually well-read for a governess, he observed one evening, finding her in the small library with a book of poetry open across her lap, after Rose had been settled for the night. My father believed a woman's education should not stop simply because society expected less of her, Eleanor said, closing the book carefully. He was not a wealthy man, Your Grace, but he was a generous one, with what he had. Was? The Duke asked gently. He passed some years ago, as did my mother, shortly after. Eleanor's voice remained steady, though something flickered briefly behind her composed expression. I have learned to manage on my own since then. That cannot have been easy. No, she agreed. But very little worth having comes easily, I have found. He sat down across from her, an informality that would have scandalized his mother had she witnessed it, a duke seated in casual conversation with his daughter's governess, as though she were an equal, rather than an employee. I find myself curious about you, Miss Marsh. There is very little to be curious about, Your Grace. I disagree. You arrived at my door with excellent references and an unusual steadiness for someone taking on such a delicate position. You handle Rose with a gentleness that suggests real affection, not merely professional duty. And there are moments, he continued, watching her carefully, when you look at her, or at me, with an expression I cannot quite place, as though you are carrying something you have not yet decided to share. Eleanor's hands stilled on the book in her lap. For one long, suspended moment, she considered telling him everything, the truth about her friendship with Rose's mother, the years of silence, the letters that had stopped arriving, the shame the Fairfax family had inflicted on a woman who had loved their son honestly and completely. But the moment passed, fear winning out over honesty, and she offered instead a careful, practiced smile. You imagine too much, Your Grace. I am simply a governess, doing her duty. He did not entirely believe her. She could see it in the slight narrowing of his eyes, but he did not press further, and for that small mercy, she was grateful. Rose asked me today when her mother is coming back, Eleanor said instead, changing the subject to something equally difficult but easier, somehow, to speak of directly. I did not know how to answer her. The Duke's expression sobered immediately. What did you tell her? I told her the truth, as gently as I could manage, that her mother loved her very much, but that she would not be coming back, and that it was not because Rose had done anything wrong. And how did she take it? Better than I expected. Children are often stronger than we give them credit for. Eleanor met his eyes directly. She asked if you loved her mother. I did not know how to answer that question either. The Duke was quiet for a long moment, staring into the small fire burning in the library grate. I did, he said finally, the words coming slowly, as though dragged up from somewhere he had long kept sealed. More than I ever admitted, even to myself. My family disapproved. She was not considered a suitable match for a man in my position, and I was too young, too proud, too afraid of my mother's disappointment to fight for what I actually wanted. I let her go, Miss Marsh. I let her go, and I told myself it was for the best, and I have regretted it every day since, though I never allowed myself to examine that regret too closely, until a 4-year-old girl appeared on my doorstep and forced me to. That is a difficult thing to admit, Eleanor said softly. It is a more difficult thing to have lived with, the Duke replied. I have spent 5 years believing she simply grew tired of me and left without a word. Only now do I understand there may have been far more to the story than I allowed myself to imagine. I do not know the details. I only know that whatever happened, whatever forced her from London, whatever led her to a death I know nothing about, my own pride played some part in it, and I do not know how to forgive myself for that. Eleanor sat very still, her heart pounding with the weight of the truth she alone possessed, the full and painful story of exactly what had happened, exactly how much his family's cruelty had cost the woman who had loved him. She wanted, desperately, to tell him everything. But she was afraid, too, of what his reaction might be, afraid of destroying the fragile trust that had begun to grow between them, afraid of her own growing feelings for a man she had originally intended to regard with nothing more than professional distance. Perhaps, she said carefully, forgiveness is not something that arrives all at once. Perhaps it is something you build slowly, through the choices you make now, for Rose, and for yourself. The Duke looked at her with an expression she could not quite read, something between gratitude and a deeper, more complicated warmth. You have a wisdom beyond your years, Miss Marsh. I have had reason to think carefully about forgiveness, Eleanor said quietly, thinking of her own guilt, her own silence, the truth she still had not found the courage to share. Neither of them spoke for a long moment, the fire crackling softly in the grate, the house quiet around them, and something unspoken passed between them, a recognition, a connection neither had expected nor entirely welcomed, but neither wished, in that moment, to deny. Outside the walls of Fairfax House, Lord Ashcombe's careful investigations were beginning to bear fruit. A former servant of the Fairfax household, dismissed years ago and still bitter over the circumstances, proved willing to share fragments of memory in exchange for a modest sum. A name began to surface, quietly, dangerously, the name of the young woman the Duke had once loved and lost, and with it, the first threads of a scandal far larger than London yet realized. Ashcombe was careful in his methods. He did not rush. He visited the modest home of the dismissed servant twice more, each time leaving with another fragment of memory, another small detail that, pieced together, began to form a picture he found immensely satisfying. He learned of a young woman who had once been seen leaving Fairfax House late in the evening, her face flushed, her manner secretive. He learned that the Dowager Duchess had once dismissed a maid abruptly, for reasons never fully explained, around the same period. He learned enough, in short, to construct a story, and in London, a well-constructed story mattered a great deal more than a true one. "You seem pleased with yourself," one of his companions remarked one evening, watching Ashcombe review his notes with obvious satisfaction. "I am simply patient," Ashcombe replied. "Fairfax has spent years looking down at the rest of us, certain his name and his coldness placed him above scrutiny. I intend to remind him, and all of London, that no one is above scrutiny forever." He began composing his letter carefully, choosing each word for maximum effect, blending just enough truth into the account to make the crueler speculations believable. He intended to wait for the perfect moment to release it, a moment when the damage would be impossible to contain or explain away. That moment, he decided, watching the invitations to the season's grandest ball being distributed throughout the city, would arrive very soon indeed. The proudest Duke in London had finally begun to open his heart. He had no way of knowing that the very openness he had fought so hard to resist was about to be tested in ways he could never have anticipated, by a scandal already gathering strength in the shadows, and by a truth his daughter's governess had carried, silently and painfully, since the very first day she walked through his door. It began with a letter, delivered not to the Duke but to half the drawing rooms of London simultaneously, ensuring maximum damage before he could even learn of its existence. Lord Ashcombe had crafted it carefully, mixing just enough fact with cruel speculation to make the story irresistible to a society already hungry for scandal, involving the proudest man in the city. By the time word reached Fairfax House, the Duke's study was already receiving a steady stream of calling cards from acquaintances suddenly curious about his private affairs, invitations quietly withdrawn, and at least 2 business associates who had, with careful and insincere apologies, decided to postpone their dealings with him indefinitely. "They are saying I seduced and abandoned a woman of no fortune, leaving her to die in poverty and shame, and that I have only now taken in the resulting child to salvage what remains of my reputation," the Duke said grimly, tossing the offending letter onto his desk when Eleanor found him there that evening, his face pale with a fury she had not seen from him before. "They are saying I am a man without honor." "That is not the truth," Eleanor said fiercely, surprising herself with the strength of her own reaction. "It does not need to be the truth, Miss Marsh. It only needs to be believable, and unfortunately, given my own past behavior, my own coldness, my own refusal to speak of Rose's mother even now, it is entirely believable to anyone who does not know the full story." He looked up at her, something raw and exhausted in his expression. "And I do not know the full story myself. Not really. I have pieced together fragments, but I do not know what truly happened to her, why she left, what she suffered. I do not know, and it is destroying me, not knowing." This was the moment Eleanor had feared and, in some quiet corner of her heart, hoped for, since her very first day in this house. She could feel the truth pressing against her lips, demanding release, no longer content to remain hidden. "Your Grace," she said, her voice unsteady, "there is something I must tell you, something I should have told you the day I arrived." He looked up sharply, some instinct warning him that whatever came next would change everything. "Tell me." Her name was Charlotte, Eleanor said, the name feeling strange and precious in her mouth after 5 years of careful silence. Charlotte Bennett. She was my dearest friend, closer to me than any sister could have been. We grew up together, in the same village, before either of us came to London. She took a steadying breath, watching the Duke's face pale as recognition dawned. "I have known, since the moment I heard Rose's name, exactly whose child she was. I have known. And I said nothing. Because I was afraid of what you might do. Afraid of how you might react. Afraid of losing this position. And if I am honest, afraid of losing something else that had begun to matter to me far more than I expected. You knew," the Duke said slowly, the words heavy with a betrayal he had not expected to feel from her, of all people. "You knew, and you let me search blindly for weeks, wondering, guessing, tearing myself apart trying to understand what had happened to her." "I am sorry," Eleanor said, and the words felt inadequate, even as she spoke them. "I did not know how to tell you without breaking something I was afraid could not be repaired." "Tell me now," he said, his voice tight with barely controlled emotion. "Tell me everything. I deserve to know. And so does Rose." Eleanor nodded, steadying herself before she began. "Charlotte loved you completely, Your Grace. She never stopped loving you, not for one single day, even after your mother came to her directly and made it clear that a match between you was impossible, that your family would never accept a woman of her modest circumstances, that if she truly cared for you, she would remove herself from your life before she ruined your prospects entirely." The Duke went very still. "My mother. She came to Charlotte's lodgings herself," Eleanor continued, her voice growing steadier now that the truth was finally being spoken aloud. "She offered her money to leave London and never return, never contact you again, never reveal that she carried your child, for by then, Charlotte already knew she was expecting. Charlotte refused the money at first. She wanted to tell you the truth, wanted to give you the choice yourself. But your mother made it clear that if she did, she would ensure Charlotte was ruined, so thoroughly that she would never find honest work again, never find anywhere safe to raise a child, that she would destroy her so completely that even the child would suffer for it. She threatened her," the Duke said, his voice barely above a whisper, horror dawning in his expression. "My own mother threatened the woman I loved, threatened my own child, and I never knew. I never knew any of it. Charlotte left London, believing she was protecting you, protecting your future, sacrificing her own happiness, so that yours would remain intact. She never blamed you, not once. Not in all the years I knew her afterward. She always said you had a good heart, even if you did not yet know how to use it freely. She raised Rose alone, in a small village far from London, working herself past the point of exhaustion to keep them both fed and sheltered. When her health began to fail, she made me promise that if anything happened to her, I would see Rose safely to your door, that I would trust you to do right by your own child, even though she herself never had the chance to ask you directly." The Duke sat in silence for a long moment, his face a mixture of grief and a fury that had nowhere immediate to land. "My mother did this," he said finally. "My mother took her from me, took years of my daughter's life from me, and let me believe for 5 years that Charlotte simply stopped loving me, simply left without explanation, simply did not think me worth staying for." "I am so sorry," Eleanor said again, tears finally slipping free despite her efforts to hold them back. "I should have told you the moment I understood the truth. I have carried this guilt every single day since I arrived, wondering if my silence was protecting anyone at all, or simply prolonging a pain that deserved to be faced honestly." The Duke rose from his desk and crossed the room, and for a moment, Eleanor feared his anger might turn toward her, that her confession had cost her the fragile trust they had built together. But instead, he stopped before her, his expression softening into something gentler, something that recognized the courage it had taken her to finally speak. "You were protecting Rose," he said quietly, "and perhaps, in your own way, protecting me from a truth I was not yet ready to hear. I understand why you waited, even if I wish you had not." "Can you forgive me?" Eleanor asked, her voice small. "There is nothing to forgive," the Duke said. "The fault lies with my mother, and with my own past cowardice, my own failure to fight for Charlotte when it mattered most. You have done nothing but care for my daughter, with a devotion I am only now beginning to understand the depth of." He paused, studying her face carefully. "I must confront my mother. I must know the full truth of what she did, and I must find some way to make certain Rose never suffers for choices that were never hers to make." "And the scandal spreading through London?" Eleanor asked. "Lord Ashcombe will not rest until he has used this against you fully." "Let him try," the Duke said, and for the first time since the letter had arrived, something like resolve steadied his expression. "I have spent my entire life protecting my family's reputation at the cost of my own happiness, and look what it has cost me. Charlotte's life. Years of Rose's childhood I can never reclaim. I will not make that same mistake again, whatever the cost to my standing in society." He left for his mother's townhouse within the hour, and Eleanor watched him go with a heart full of both relief at finally sharing the truth and fear for what confrontation might bring, not only between the Duke and his mother, but for the future of the fragile, precious family that had begun, so unexpectedly, to take root within the walls of Fairfax House. The Dowager Duchess received her son in her private sitting room, and she knew from the set of his jaw, the moment he entered, that whatever composure she had maintained for 5 years was about to be tested beyond repair. "You went to her," the Duke said, without preamble. "You went to Charlotte and threatened her until she left London, and never told me she was carrying my child." His mother's face went pale, but she did not immediately deny it. "I did what was necessary to protect this family. You destroyed a woman I loved. You cost me 5 years of my daughter's life. You let me believe, for half a decade, that I had simply been abandoned, when in truth, you had frightened away the one person who might have made me happy. Happiness is not the only consideration for a man in your position, Alexander," his mother said, her voice rising to match his, though it trembled now with something closer to fear than conviction. "You had a duty to this family, to this name. I could not allow a match so far beneath you to ruin everything your father and I worked to build. And what have you built, Mother, that was worth more than my happiness, worth more than Charlotte's life? She died, believing I did not want her. She died raising our daughter alone, in poverty, because you decided your own comfort mattered more than the truth." The Dowager Duchess's composure finally broke, and for the first time in his life, the Duke watched his mother weep, not the practiced, decorative tears of society, but something raw and unguarded. "I did not know she would die," she said, her voice cracking. "I never intended such a thing. I only wanted her gone, out of your life, so that you might make a better match, a safer choice. I did not know, Alexander. I did not know what it would cost." "You knew enough," the Duke said, though some of the fury had drained from his voice, replaced by an exhaustion that ran bone deep. "You knew enough to threaten a frightened young woman carrying a child, and you did it anyway." He left her sitting room without another word, without waiting for further explanation or apology, and though something between them would never be entirely repaired, a small, grudging seed of understanding had been planted that night, one that would take years to grow into anything resembling forgiveness. The confrontation between the Duke and his mother lasted well into the night, and though Eleanor never learned every word exchanged between them, she saw the aftermath clearly enough in the hollow, exhausted look on the Duke's face when he finally returned. Whatever the Dowager Duchess Margaret had admitted, whatever excuses she had offered, it was clear the relationship between mother and son had been altered permanently, a wound that would take considerably longer than a single evening to heal, if it ever fully healed at all. But there was no time to dwell on private grief. Lord Ashcombe's carefully planted scandal had already taken root across London, and within days, the whispers had grown into something far louder, far more dangerous. Invitations continued to disappear. Old friends grew suddenly distant. And worst of all, threats began to reach Fairfax House directly, hinting that unless the Duke publicly disowned Rose, denying any connection to a child born of scandal, his family's standing in society would be destroyed entirely, along with any hope of restoring the Fairfax name to respectability. "They want me to send her away," the Duke said one evening, pacing his study with barely contained anger. "Ashcombe has made it clear, through intermediaries too cowardly to approach me directly, that if I publicly deny Rose, the scandal will quietly fade. If I claim her, he intends to see us both ruined." "What will you do?" Eleanor asked, though something in her steady gaze suggested she already knew the answer, and trusted him to reach it on his own. The Duke stopped pacing and looked at her, and then, through the open study door, at Rose, who sat cross-legged on the hallway carpet nearby, carefully arranging a small collection of wooden blocks into something resembling a castle, utterly unaware of the storm gathering around her small, steady world. "I have spent my entire life protecting a name," the Duke said slowly, "a reputation built on distance and pride, and the careful avoidance of anything that might invite judgment. I told myself that name was worth protecting above all else. I was wrong. I have never been more certain of anything in my life." 3 days later, at a grand ball hosted by one of London's most influential families, an event attended by nearly every notable member of society, including a smugly confident Lord Ashcombe, the Duke of Fairfax arrived with his daughter beside him, her small hand held firmly in his, and Eleanor Marsh walking just behind them both. The room fell into stunned silence as they entered. A duke, appearing at a formal society event with an acknowledged illegitimate child at his side, was so far outside the bounds of accepted behavior that even the most seasoned gossips in the room found themselves briefly speechless. Lord Ashcombe recovered first, a slow, cruel smile spreading across his face as he approached. "Fairfax," he said loudly, ensuring every nearby guest could hear clearly. "How bold of you to bring your little scandal out in public. Have you nothing to say for yourself?" The Duke met his gaze without flinching, and when he spoke, his voice carried easily across the suddenly silent ballroom. "This is my daughter Rose," he said clearly. "Her mother was a woman I loved more deeply than I ever had the courage to admit, a woman my own family drove from London through threats and cruelty, rather than accept a match beneath their expectations. I was a coward for 5 years, Ashcombe, allowing my pride and my family's approval to matter more than the woman I loved and the child she carried. I will not compound that cowardice by denying my own daughter now, whatever it costs me in this room tonight." A murmur swept through the crowd, shock and fascination in equal measure. "You would ruin your own family's name for a bastard child," Ashcombe sneered. "She is not a bastard," the Duke said, his voice hardening. "She is my daughter, born of a woman I should have married, and any dishonor in this situation belongs entirely to those who drove her mother away, not to a 4-year-old girl who has done nothing but arrive in this world deserving of love and protection." He looked around the silent room, meeting the eyes of guests he had known for years, some sympathetic, some scandalized, none entirely indifferent. "If London wishes to judge me for finally choosing honesty over pride, I accept that judgment. But I will not deny my own child to preserve a reputation I no longer believe was worth protecting at such a cost." He knelt down beside Rose, who had watched the entire exchange with wide, uncertain eyes, sensing the tension in the room without fully understanding its cause. "You are my daughter," he said to her, loudly enough for the room to hear, though the words were meant only for her. "And I am proud, more proud than I have ever been of anything in my life, to claim you before all of London tonight." Rose's small face broke into a relieved smile, and she threw her arms around his neck without hesitation. utterly unconcerned with the scandalized whispers filling the room around them. Lord Ashcombe, his triumphant scheme collapsing before the entire gathering, found himself with nothing left to say. The scandal he had hoped would destroy the Duke had instead, through the Duke's own unexpected courage, transformed into something entirely different. A story not of shame but of a proud man finally choosing love over pride, however costly that choice might prove. Not everyone in the room that evening extended sympathy or understanding. Several families quietly withdrew their acquaintance in the days that followed. A handful of business partnerships were indeed lost. But something else happened as well, something the Duke had not anticipated. A number of his peers, quietly, privately, expressed a respect for his honesty that his previous cold reputation had never earned him. Society, it seemed, was more complicated and more forgiving than Ashcombe had hoped, especially when faced with genuine courage rather than calculated scandal. Eleanor watched the entire scene unfold from a short distance, her heart full of a pride and tenderness she could no longer pretend was merely professional affection for her employer. When the Duke's eyes finally found hers across the crowded ballroom, something passed between them, unspoken but unmistakable, a recognition of everything they had endured together to reach this moment. The room slowly began to move again, whispers rising and falling like a tide, as guests turned to one another to exchange opinions on what they had just witnessed. An elderly countess, known throughout London for her sharp tongue and sharper judgments, approached the Duke with a look that could have gone either way. "I have known your family for 40 years, Fairfax," she said. "I watched your father stand in this very room and turn away a good man for the crime of poverty. I did not expect to see his son do the opposite. I hope that pleases you, Lady Winslow, and not merely offends your sense of propriety," the Duke said carefully. The Countess studied him a long moment, then permitted herself the smallest of smiles. "There is nothing improper about honesty, young man, however inconvenient it proves. I shall call on you next week. Bring the child. I find I am rather curious about her." Not every reaction was so generous. A cluster of matrons near the refreshment table made no effort to lower their voices as the Duke passed, and two families quietly gathered their things and departed within the hour, making their disapproval as visible as etiquette allowed. But for every guest who turned away, another seemed to lean in with new interest, and by the time the evening drew to its close, the story spreading through London was no longer simply one of scandal, but of a proud man who had, against every expectation, chosen his daughter over his own name. The scandal had not destroyed him. If anything, it had revealed the man beneath the pride, the man Charlotte had always insisted was there, waiting patiently to be given the chance to prove himself. The days following the ball brought a strange and unexpected quiet to Fairfax House, the kind of stillness that settles after a great storm has finally passed. The scandal did not vanish entirely. London's memory for gossip rarely fades so quickly, but its power to wound had been broken the moment the Duke chose honesty over concealment. Slowly, cautiously, invitations began to reappear. Old acquaintances, having watched Lord Ashcombe's scheme collapse so publicly, found themselves reconsidering their hasty judgments. The Duke of Fairfax, it seemed, had gained something far more valuable than his previous untouchable reputation, a measure of genuine respect earned through honesty rather than distance. But it was within the walls of his own home that the truest change had taken root. The Duke found himself, one quiet evening, standing outside the library, where Eleanor sat reading by the fire, exactly as she had been the very first time he had noticed how deeply he had come to value her presence in his life. He stood in the doorway for a long moment, simply watching her, before he finally spoke. "Miss Marsh," he said, "may I speak with you about something that has nothing to do with Rose's education?" Eleanor looked up, setting her book aside carefully. "Of course, Your Grace." He crossed the room slowly, choosing his words with the same careful deliberation he might have applied to a matter of state. "When you first arrived in this house, I believed I required only a competent governess, someone to manage the practical difficulties of raising a child I barely understood. I did not expect to find someone whose honesty, whose courage, and whose quiet strength would change the way I understood not only my daughter, but myself." "Your Grace," Eleanor began, uncertain where this conversation was leading, though her heart had already begun to race with a hope she barely allowed herself to acknowledge. "Please," he said, "let me finish, before my own pride finds some way to stop me." He took a breath. "I spent 5 years believing I had lost the only woman I ever truly loved because she chose to leave me, when in truth, she was driven away by people who should have protected her happiness instead of destroying it. I have spent these past months watching you care for my daughter with a devotion that asked for nothing in return, watching you carry a painful secret out of loyalty to a friend you clearly loved dearly, and watching you tell me a difficult truth even when you feared it might cost you everything. I do not wish to make the same mistake twice, Eleanor. I do not wish to let pride, or fear, or uncertainty keep me from telling you plainly what I have come to feel." Eleanor's breath caught. "And what is that, Your Grace?" "I love you," he said simply, the words unpolished and entirely sincere, so different from the careful, guarded speech she had come to expect from him. "Not as Rose's governess, not as a convenient companion in a difficult season of my life, but as the woman I wish to build a future alongside, if you will have me." For a long moment, Eleanor could not speak, emotion rising too quickly for words to keep pace. "I have loved you for longer than I dared admit, even to myself," she finally said, her voice trembling slightly. "I told myself it was foolish, that a duke and a governess could never truly belong together, that my feelings were an inconvenience I ought to bury alongside every other secret I have carried in this house. But I do not wish to bury this one." The Duke reached for her hand, holding it gently, as though it were something precious he intended never to let go of again. "Then let us stop burying what matters most," he said. "Marry me, Eleanor. Not because Rose requires a mother, though she has already come to love you as one, but because I cannot imagine building the rest of my life without you beside me."
"Yes," Eleanor said, tears slipping freely down her cheeks now, though her smile was brighter than any expression he had seen from her before.
"Yes, I will marry you." When they told Rose the following morning, her reaction was immediate and utterly without surprise, as though the news simply confirmed something she had already understood, long before the adults around her had caught up to the truth. "I knew you would," she said matter-of-factly, climbing into her father's lap while reaching for Eleanor's hand at the same time, drawing them both close, in the simple, instinctive way children often manage far more gracefully than adults. "Mama Charlotte said you had a good heart, Papa. And Miss Eleanor has the kindest eyes in all of London." It was only a matter of time. The wedding that followed was smaller and quieter than London's grandest society events typically demanded, held in the gardens of Fairfax House rather than a fashionable church, attended by those who had proven their genuine loyalty, rather than those who valued only appearances. The Dowager Duchess Margaret, humbled considerably by the confrontation that had followed the scandal, attended as well, standing at a careful distance, though the Duke noted, with a complicated mixture of lingering hurt and cautious hope, that she wept quietly during the ceremony, and that she knelt afterward to speak gently with her granddaughter for the first time without pretense or condition. Lord Ashcombe, having lost both his scheme and much of his social standing in the aftermath of his failed scandal, found himself increasingly excluded from the very circles he had once dominated, a quiet consequence that required no further intervention from the Duke at all. Society, it seemed, had little patience for cruelty, once genuine courage had been so publicly and convincingly demonstrated. Years later, those who remembered the proudest Duke in London, the cold and untouchable man who had once kept the entire city at arm's length, found it difficult to reconcile that memory with the warm, contented figure who could often be seen walking through the gardens of Fairfax House with his daughter's hand in his and his wife at his side, laughter carrying easily across the grounds in a way it never had during his earlier, guarded years. Rose grew into a thoughtful, spirited young woman, fiercely loved by both her father and the woman who had become, in every way that mattered, her true mother. She never forgot the story of her birth mother's courage and sacrifice, and she carried that story with pride rather than shame, understanding, even as a child, that love had ultimately triumphed over the pride and fear that had nearly kept her family apart forever. And the Duke himself, when asked in later years by curious acquaintances how a man once so famously cold had transformed so completely, would simply smile, a genuine, unguarded smile that would have astonished the London society of his younger years, and say that it had taken nothing more than a 4-year-old girl on a rainy doorstep calling him Papa, to teach him that pride was never worth more than the people brave enough to love him despite it. He had been the proudest duke in London. He had learned, in the end, that being loved mattered infinitely more. In the years that followed the wedding, Fairfax House became known throughout London, not for its coldness or its silence, but for a warmth few could have imagined possible within those grand old walls. The Duke, once so guarded that even his closest acquaintances struggled to name a single softness in him, became known instead for the patience he showed his growing household, for the laughter that carried easily through the corridors, and for a quiet generosity toward those less fortunate that he never spoke of publicly, but which many in London came, over time, to recognize and respect. 2 years after the wedding, Eleanor gave birth to a son, a small, round-faced boy, with his father's dark hair and his mother's steady gray eyes. Rose, by then 6 years old, appointed herself his fiercest protector from the very first day, informing anyone who would listen that she had been the one to soften their father's heart, and that she intended to make certain her little brother grew up knowing exactly how loved he was. The Dowager Duchess, humbled by the events that had unfolded and determined to make what amends she could, became, slowly and imperfectly, a genuine presence in her grandchildren's lives. She never fully escaped the guilt of what her interference had cost, and the Duke never entirely forgot it either, but the years brought a fragile peace between them, built one small kindness at a time. She often sat with Rose in the garden, teaching her the names of flowers, listening to stories about a mother she had never met but had come, through her granddaughter's memories, to understand had been a woman of remarkable courage. Lord Ashcombe faded from London's most fashionable circles within a year of his failed scheme, his reputation for cruelty having finally caught up with him in a society that, however slow to change, had little patience left for a man who built his standing on the misfortune of others. He was seen occasionally at lesser gatherings in later years, a diminished figure, and the Duke, when their paths crossed, offered him nothing more than a polite, distant nod, having long since stopped allowing the man any real space in his thoughts. Eleanor, meanwhile, found herself embraced by a circle of friends and acquaintances she had never expected to belong to, women who admired the quiet strength she had shown throughout the difficult early months of her marriage, and who came, over time, to value her honest counsel above the empty flattery so common in society. She never forgot Charlotte, and she made certain Rose never did either, keeping alive the memory of a mother whose love and sacrifice had, in the end, brought this entire family into being. On quiet evenings, the Duke could often be found in the nursery long after the children had fallen asleep, simply watching them, a habit he had carried since that very first night Rose had come to him with a bad dream and climbed uninvited into his heart. Eleanor would find him there sometimes, and she would slip her hand into his without a word, and together they would stand in the soft candlelight, grateful for a life neither of them could have imagined on the rainy night it all began. Rose grew older, attending her first proper season, with a confidence that startled the same society that had once whispered about her birth. She never hid from her past, never allowed shame to take root where her father had shown her only pride belonged. When young men asked, with careful curiosity, about the story of her arrival at Fairfax House, she told it plainly and without embarrassment, watching, more often than not, as their curiosity transformed into genuine admiration for the family she had helped create. The Duke, standing at the edge of a ballroom many years after that first fateful night, watching his daughter dance with an easy grace her mother would have been proud of, found himself thinking, as he often did in quiet moments, of the strange and unlikely path that had led him here. He had spent the first half of his life believing pride was the only armor worth wearing, the only inheritance worth protecting. He had learned, through a 4-year-old girl on a rainy doorstep and a governess brave enough to speak an uncomfortable truth, that there was a far greater inheritance available to those willing to risk everything for it. Love, he had come to understand, asked for nothing but honesty in return. And honesty, however costly in the moment, always proved, in the end, to be the far lighter burden to carry. He caught Eleanor's eye across the room, and she smiled at him the way she had smiled at him 100 times since that evening in the library, and the proudest Duke in London, now simply a devoted husband and father, crossed the floor to stand beside the woman who had taught him what his pride had never allowed him to learn on his own.